Hello, I'm Dr. Musil, and welcome to Lecture 10, Natural Law Theory, where we'll talk about what St. Thomas Aquinas has to say about morality. This is the short detour I referenced in the Part 2 Lecture 9 video when I mentioned we would talk a little bit about natural law theory and what Aquinas says before we talk about Immanuel Kant and dive into deontology and talk more about what Kant has to say. And the reason for that is we need to talk about natural law theory at some point. We actually already reference the idea of natural law, and more on this in a moment when we talked about John Locke and what he has to say, when we talked about that back in Lecture 4. But we have to spend some time at some point in the semester talking about what Aquinas has to say about morality, because it is an important contribution, I would say, in terms of these moral theories that have been offered throughout our history. And there's no, in my opinion, in terms of the schedule, there's no better place to put it. And hopefully that kind of makes sense once we go through the Aquinas, and then once we get to Kant and you see the similarities, maybe it'll make more sense than why it is I selected at this point to discuss Aquinas and then the idea of natural law theory. So this is, again, the slight detour I referenced. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about natural law theory, and then we'll dive into our discussion of deontology, an extended discussion of that, again, through an extended discussion of Immanuel Kant, what he has to say. Before we get into Aquinas and natural law theory, I actually have a few housekeeping notes that I want to mention over here. And again, I think I mentioned this way back in some of the first videos. I have a terrible memory, so if I think of something, I've got to say it, otherwise it's gone. So in view of that, I wanted to mention, as I was preparing for this video, I realized for the first time that when I say I've been working with this textbook, right, that the department puts together, and it's only a few years old, and I've been with them since the very beginning when they were first starting to put it together, and we used it from the very beginning. So we had like preliminary editions, and I even forgot the word that they used. Back when there wasn't even any binding, just when it was just pages, we would use it. And so, but the point being, I've been using multiple versions of this, and I realized that I have printed off versions of all these lectures in here that I have as backups typically when I go into classes, and I've been using those for all these video lectures, and I've been going through, using those. Whereas in class, I usually don't. I just use the same PowerPoint presentations that I've uploaded for you guys. Anyway, I printed these hard copies off a few years ago, and I realized that these are based off of an earlier version of the textbook. So the whole point being, in previous videos, when you hear me say, and this is from page 28 of the textbook, it could very well actually be a completely different page, because I know that, for one, this one, so you can see in the corner here, I printed this one off back in 2018, and I was about to use this for this video, and I realized, hey, these pages aren't actually matching up with the PowerPoint. And so I printed off a new version. This one should match up with your PowerPoint, which does match up with this version of the book. So my apologies if you've tried to find something in the previous video. Maybe this doesn't actually ring a bell for anyone. You're like, what is he talking about? But there might be, and I'll go back and watch the videos and find out if there are any instances where I cite the textbook, cite a particular page, and then it doesn't actually match up with the current iteration of the textbook we're using. And hopefully, I'll remember to print off more current versions of the PowerPoint presentation as I do these lectures henceforth. That should be the only issue with the previous videos. I just wanted to point that out and acknowledge that I did realize that I did that, in case there were instances where there was things not aligning. And hopefully, again, that won't be an issue moving forward. So that's that one. Going back to lecture 5, and I guess I lied when I said we won't ever have to worry about previous material once we get to a new section. This is just for your own personal reference. You actually don't have to worry about it in terms of the section 2 quiz. But remember, we're talking about paternalism, right? The idea that you intervene in someone's behavior, either restricting what they can do or making them do something, in both cases against their will, presumably for their own benefit. And we talked about Mill and what he has to say, right, in lecture 5, and how he was kind of very much worried about that sort of approach. And I mentioned, prohibitions against, alcohol or marijuana or prostitution and so on, how those are instances of the state, right, engaging in paternalistic measures. And a classic example that some of you might be familiar with that I usually always remember to bring up if we were in class, and for whatever reason I forgot to mention it in the lecture by video, is in the state of New York for a while, and I don't know what the current status of these laws are, but I know for a while they had laws in place regulating the size of a drink that you could order from a convenience store. So you could no longer order, for example, 64-ounce cups. Instead, you could only order, let's say, up to like 24-ounce. The idea being that they're terrible for you, right? Big, gigantic cups of soda is terrible for you. Of course, what did people end up doing? Buying several of the smaller sizes. So, needless to say, it didn't seem to work. But that's another example, a classic example, a more recent example that was very much, at least at the time, again, this is a couple decades ago, maybe at this point, but at the time was very much in the news and that people were aware of. So I like that example. And then this is a distinction that I want to bring up while I'm thinking about it, and then I will definitely reference back to it. I'm surprised I haven't mentioned it already. I have mentioned the idea that, that we might be able to acknowledge there are instances where what we think we could do in a certain situation doesn't map up with what we think we ought to do. So we might be behind the fat man in the cave and think like a utilitarian, hey, the proper thing to do is blow this guy up. But then you might be able to admit, I could never personally do that. So if I were in that situation, I'd be drowning because I could never, and if it would, depended on me to blow him up, we'd all be drowning because I couldn't actually bring myself to do it, even though I thought it was the morally appropriate thing to do. So a good, interesting distinction there. I think one that's worth hammering home. This is another pertinent distinction, not the same one, and that's that I think it behooves us to keep this in mind as we go through all these various moral theories. That keep in mind that what these guys say in theory is one thing, and then carrying it out in practice is another. So I mentioned, as we've been going through these theories, I like to allude to various problems or criticisms that the critics have voiced with respect to these theories. A lot of them tend to be practical. So, for example, the utilitarians. How are we ever supposed to be expected to perform these long, cumbersome utility calculations? That's an issue in carrying out the theory in practice. And my point that I want to bring up and drive home is that, hey, what these guys say in theory might be correct, and then it might just be the case that the truth isn't pretty, right? And that in practice we can just never carry it out. So in other words, they might really be correct, the utilitarians. I'm not saying they are, but maybe in theory they're right. Doing whatever promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number really is what we ought to do. And then maybe it's the case that we just practically can't ever carry that out. And so we'll be echoing this point, or I'll be echoing this point when we get to Kant in lecture 11, because I'm going to be, he'll make the same point himself in raising sort of some concerns. How are we ever supposed to know what the intentions are of a person, right? Because that's how he's going to say we ought to measure, more or less, measure the moral worth of an action is basing it on the motive or intent of the person. And he himself acknowledges problems with actually discerning and being certain of the motives behind actions. So he might be right that in theory, the correct action is dictated by what somebody has in mind, right, before the action took place. But in practice, we can't ever unearth that motive or intention. Okay, so what these guys say in theory is one thing, and then carrying that out in practice is another. And hey, it might be the case that one of these dudes or dudettes has the proper theory, and it might also be the case that, practically speaking, we're in a bind and can't ever carry it out. Okay? It might be, but who knows? Maybe not. Anyway, so those are my housekeeping points. Let's move on to Saint Thomas Aquinas and this natural law theory. And I referenced when I talked about Aquinas leading up to this, I think again it was at the end of the last video, his similarities to Aristotle and obviously Kant, right? I mentioned that's the impetus. The reason why I'm throwing this in now is because there are so many similarities with respect to Aquinas and Kant. I forgot to actually mention the one you guys are most familiar with, and that's Locke. We talked about this idea of a natural law back in the lecture 4 video, right? Wherein we talked about that being a crucial difference between Locke's version of the state of nature and Hobbes's version of the state of nature. Locke believes in this idea of a natural law. And of course, I should point out that Aquinas is right smack dab in the 13th century, don't quote me on this, but I want to say like 1224 to 1227 or 1275. Like 50, he lived to be about 50 years old and was right in the middle of the 13th century. So, point being, Locke comes on the scene after him. So, Locke, more or less, probably being influenced by Aquinas here, right? It's not Aquinas being influenced by Locke, because Locke comes on the scene, hundreds of years later. But he's the one that we talked about first, and he's the one that you would have presumably been familiar with, right? We already talked about this idea of natural law, and remove all the religious components from Aquinas and his version of morality, and you basically have kind of what Locke offered and what we've more or less already talked about. So, in some sense, you're already familiar with the very idea of Aquinas' version of morality. And I think one of the important points to point out, and that's what the editors of the textbook pointed out in the preface, right, the intro to the Aquinas excerpt, and that's that, Aquinas did take pains to emphasize it. Natural law theory is rooted in rationality, in our rational capacity, and it doesn't, technically speaking, require, any divine spark. Now, of course, this is where it gets tricky, because Aquinas really does think that it's all thanks to God, right? But at the same time, it is important to point out, as the editors of the textbook do, that we can, even an atheist, right, can figure all this out, because again, Aquinas roots it all in rationality, right, our rational capacity, as does Locke. Again, that's the very reason why Locke says we have a sense of morality even in a state of nature, because we have our rational capacity, which allows us to, upon reflection, realize that, hey, there are others just like us, and because our life seems valuable, then we should treat them similarly. Okay, and that's pretty much the same thing Aquinas is getting at, of course, before Locke, though, right? Okay, but let's back up. I'm already getting into points that are ahead of us here, but I wanted to point out, I guess, at the outset that you are already kind of familiar with the gist of what we're going to be getting at for the most part here. So we'll be talking about natural law theory in general, and we'll get into some general concerns later in the lecture that do kind of hinge on not only the rational nature of the theory and basing everything in rationality, but also then some of the religious tentacles that may or may not be attached to the theory, right? And we'll discuss that in more detail later. But that's the roadmap. But now I want to go back, talk a little bit about Aquinas. Again, 13th century Catholic priest, pretty well known. In fact, some of you guys might be more familiar with Aquinas than myself, if you have a particularly strong religious upbringing, or if you know a lot about Catholicism, for example, or have any history in philosophy. Odds are you have some exposure to Aquinas. Pretty famous out of all the I referenced back in the intro lecture video, like lecture 1, the medieval era. Right, there are the 3 monks that stand out: Anselm, Aquinas, and Augustine. And Aquinas is probably the most famous, the most well-known. Another thing I mentioned in that video was that there was this prominent theme in the medieval era, being the theme being that there was a great deal of admiration and appreciation for the ancient philosophers before them. And I mentioned Augustine was sort of known as being a scholar of Plato, right, and Plato's philosophy. And Aquinas, I mentioned at the time, was well known for being an Aristotelian, being well versed in Aristotle's philosophy. Well, that is definitely what Aquinas is known for. He's known for, as I mentioned in the first bullet point of slide 2 of the lecture, known especially amongst philosophers, known for marrying Aristotle's philosophy with his own theology. And I'm familiar with quite familiar with Aristotle's philosophy, and somewhat familiar with Aquinas, and just being, if you've read a little bit of both, you can see it right off the bat, just their similarities in terms of how they approach it. Their methodology is very similar. But then conceptually, too, you'll see the influence of Aristotle in Aquinas' philosophy, because he'll use a lot of the same conceptual terms, like this idea of the good life, which, Aristotle talks a lot about, and that's a chief concern for Aquinas, too. So we'll talk more about Aristotle's influence, I guess, on the next slide. But going back to that point I was mentioning a moment ago, right? He is going to, with the idea of natural law theory, the emphasis is going to be on reason, not God per se, right? But reason. So although Aquinas is well known for in religious circles and for his theology. For most of what we're talking about here, it is important, as again the editors of the textbook point out, it is important to focus on and point out that for Aquinas, what really matters is not God, but reason. Okay, if you got reason, then you are capable of moral respect and moral responsibility. So that's why I say I get the second bullet point on the slide 2. So while he's known for his theology, Aquinas, quote, "It is important to note that adherents of natural law theory insists its principles and concepts can be arrived at through entirely rational means." And that's from 156 of the textbook, and that is correctly cited, I believe. Anyway, I'll have to double check that again. But so again, that's the editors pointing that out. And as they point out, for a natural law theorist like Aquinas, quote, "Reason alone can tell us what we are to do to advance our own flourishing." And that idea of advancing our own flourishing, that smacks of Aristotle as well, right? His idea, Aristotle, that is, you don't have to worry about this right now, but this is a term that we will become very familiar with in the Aristotle lecture, eudaimonia. That is flourishing or happiness. It's most often translated, it's a Greek term, translated as flourishing or the good life or something along those lines. And that's, again, that sort of idea is what Aquinas has in mind. And what Aquinas is going to suggest is that our rational capacity illuminates, kind of like what Aristotle suggests as well, the ticket or the best path, right, to eudaimonia. Now, Aristotle's going to talk a lot about habits and forming the proper character, which for him means our habits and the ways we behave over time, whereas you don't necessarily get that emphasis on character in Aquinas. But again, you get that focus on reason spelling out the path to the good life, or this eudaimonia, as Aristotle might say. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Aquinas, again, a great resource. I've mentioned that in previous videos. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Its article on Aquinas echoes this point, suggesting Aquinas, quote, "never abandons the fundamental affirmation of the human capacity to understand, apart from revelation or considerations of God, the nature of happiness." Okay, so, strictly speaking, God isn't needed. Okay, and that's the difference. So a lot of people, bring up divine command theory, which Aquinas is very much sort of tied to as well. And I think the important difference there is there are explicit ties to, something being issued by God for the divine command theorist. Whereas, technically speaking, for the natural law theorist, you don't need that appeal to God. All you have, or all you need, at least, right, is this appeal to reason. Let's go back, moving on to slide 3, go back and reiterate his being influenced by Aristotle. That's what I'm pointing out on slide 3 here, especially that idea of eudaimonia and the good life. In view of Aristotle's conception of the good life, right, it's in view of that, quote, "Aquinas defines laws as rules intended to direct those being governed by the laws toward the good." And again, that's a common sort of way of talking for Aristotle's. Everything's directed toward the good. Everything for him has a purpose, a telos, an end or a purpose. And ours, and of course, rationality is going to be key for Aristotle, right? Ours is to reach the good life, or a state of eudaimonia. And that's going to entail, again, the exercise of our rational capacity for Aristotle, as it does for Aquinas. For Aquinas, quote, "the natural law is what tells us how to live so that we may move toward what is truly good for us as rational beings." End quote. And that's from, both those quotes were from 156 of the textbook. So, certainly influenced by Aristotle. And you will see yourself, just in the little bits we read, right, the bit we've read for Aquinas, and the bit we will, if you haven't done it already, will read for Aristotle, you will see the similarities in sort of the conceptual terms they use, even their methodology. You'll see kind of how it's similar. Also want to note, as I mentioned, right, obviously similarities to Locke and Kant as well. Okay, for Locke, remember, it's very similar to what's going on with Aquinas. Okay, they both root morality and in this idea of respect, right, that this rational capacity allows us to have, right? It's thanks to our reflection, our rational capacity, that we realize, hey, there are others that are in very similar circumstances, that are no different than me, and I seem valuable, so by extension, why aren't they then too valuable, right? It's this sort of rational, reflective process that goes on that Aquinas and Locke want to say it's thanks to that sort of thing that makes us moral creatures then. So again, I mentioned this earlier, bullet point here. That was why Locke was different from Hobbes, because Locke sort of shared this idea of Aquinas, is that this rational capacity will elicit this sympathetic capacity, right? This sympathetic tendency, maybe even on the part of human beings, right? Through this rational capacity and this ability to reason, we can't help but come to appreciate, right, and respect others, okay, who are also like us. And again, remember, that's exactly how Locke spoke. We went through that towards the beginning of the Lecture 4 video. And as we'll see, so, just as he's similar to what we already talked about with respect to Locke, we'll then see how he's very, very similar to a lot of things Kant's going to say. I mean, Kant more so than, you're going to clearly see it here with Aquinas, but Kant, arguably more so than anyone else, right, sort of pleads for the importance or significance of reason when it comes to morality. Okay, so that, if nothing else, illuminates a huge similarity between him and then Aquinas. So stay tuned. You'll see how both Aquinas and Kant are similar, and again, why we're discussing them, right back to back. You'll see the similarities as we proceed here. So let's go ahead and then dive into what Aquinas actually says. Okay, having discussed the similarities. We have, obviously, so this is natural law theory, so this is turning to slide 5 of the lecture. Let's talk a little bit about, and it's natural law theory. Well, what's this idea of a law? And even here, you're going to have, what he says and how he conceptualizes the idea of a law is exactly the same, seemingly, as Locke, and certainly the same as what Kant has in mind when he conceptualizes this idea of a law. So what do these guys have in mind? What does Aquinas mean by a law? It's, again, not surprisingly, going to have this rational element to it. Okay, all of them except, I would say, the divine law. So we'll talk about these different types of laws that he discusses here in a moment. And that gets his discussion of divine law is anomalous, it seems like, in some sense, but for the most part, with respect to how he conceptualizes law, right, and all of its types and versions, this rational nature of it seems prominent, right? That there's this rational component to this idea of a law. So in general, well, here you go, right? So on slide 5, that's kind of I offer several quotations from the text, which then support that idea, right? That this idea of law for him is rooted in our rational capacity. So he says on 161, in general, quote, a law is nothing else than a dictate of reason and the ruler by whom his subjects are governed. Okay, so again, it's a dictate of reason, he says. It has something to do clearly with our rational capacity. This is from 160, quote, a law is something pertaining to reason, end quote. 162, he says, quote, the proper effect of law is to make those to whom it is given good, end quote. And that sounds very Aristotelian as well. Again, it's directed to the good. And then 160, he says, law, being a rule and measure, can be in a person in two ways. In one way, as in him that rules and measures, and another way as that in which is ruled and measured. And I think what he's getting at here is that, for us rational creatures, a law applies to us in two different ways, right? In one way, we ourselves are capable of instituting laws and making laws, and this is the ticket for Kant, by the way, in terms of the categorical imperative and how we are able to even be capable of morality, right? We're law formulating people or entities or beings. We're capable of instituting laws, right? That's the way in which it rules and measures, the first way, right? We're creating laws that then, in theory, right, would help solicit whoever they apply to, solicit the good for them. And so, too, in some sense, we have laws applied to us, right? For example, the eternal law, right? Or, God sort of structures our own life, right? And so that's the sense in which we're ruled and measured ourselves. Right? We have these laws that are applied to us right? And in that fashion, then direct us to the good as well. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. I know that I've had questions about that in the past. How is it that the law exists in us in two ways? Well, we are on the receiving end, right? God in general instills, right, the structure and order in everything, including us and all rational creatures. And then as a rational creature, we can then also institute laws ourselves or structure things ourselves and direct things ourselves. Okay. So that's that. Let's turn to slide 6, where we get into then a discussion of the different types of law. So hopefully it's kind of clear what he means in general by this idea of a law. It has something to do with, obviously, being sort of this idea of directing towards the good, right? It is aimed, right? It helps solicit the good, and it's rooted in reason, right? It has some sort of rational nature about it, right? It requires a rational capacity to sort of to discern it. And that seems true, again, of all laws except for maybe the divine law, which seems to be an anomaly. More on that in a second. But let's get into then the types of law that Aquinas very clearly appeals to. Right? He appeals to 4 distinct types, at the very least. Right? We have the eternal law, and this was again, I've had this happen in prior lectures, right? Where I'm in prior videos, I mentioned something similar, right? Where I'm quoting something that came from a part of the text that's very close to our excerpt, but wasn't actually included in our excerpt. So it's not included, hence that's why I say not included, but I just want to point out it's very close to what we actually did read. He says, quote, and this is him essentially defining what he means by eternal law. Eternal law is nothing else than the type of divine wisdom as directing all actions and movements. And I'll say more on eternal law here on the next slide. Then we have this idea of divine. So eternal law is kind of, the way I think of it is like it's sort of all-encompassing, overarching general structure of the universe as instituted by God. Right? Then we have divine law, and this, again, more or less, the idea is all of these are kind of an element of eternal law or participate in the eternal law. I'm not sure the best way to maybe put that. But all of these, right, eternal law sort of captures all structure of the universe, if you will, and all intention and telos, right, that Greek term, purpose and order in the universe. Okay? And divine law is sort of our way of accessing that eternal law, and the way we access it with respect to divine law is through like holy text. It's or another way of putting it is by way of revelation, which is what I'm getting at here. Okay. So it's again another way that we can access the eternal law in general by way of revelation or by way of God's grace somehow, right? And I think it's not rational. That's an important kind of point here. And in some sense, it doesn't seem typical of law in general, given everything we already said, right? And that's why I said earlier it seems kind of anomalous, but it's right because our rational access to the eternal law is what he means by the natural law. That is how we sort of garner an appreciation for the underlying structure of the universe, including our own needs and wants and our own structure, thanks to God, Aquinas would say, and what we need to thrive and survive and flourish. And that is entirely a rational process, Aquinas says. So this, right, natural laws is our rational access to the eternal law, and divine law seems to be, again, sort of another way of access, if you will, that doesn't seem rational. It seems, again, maybe it's by way of holy text or some other form of revelation. So I've tried to distinguish those two, divine and natural. And then human law is kind of then us instituting laws ourselves, a rule or regulation stipulated by the government or another authoritative power. Right? Maybe it's parents' laws within the house, so to speak, right? Ruling the children, if you will. And so it's us instituting, right, in theory at least, some sort of structure or order aimed at soliciting the good for whoever it applies to. Okay? So these are all the different versions or types of laws that he talks about. And moving on to slide 7, let's go in and focus in a little bit more detail first on eternal law, and then we'll talk a little bit more, obviously, more detail about the natural law. So eternal law, I tried to describe this on the last slide a moment ago, and it's kind of what it's getting at is that the idea of the underlying structure and purpose of the universe, right? And all the sophisticated nuances of that in the process, right? And the individual purposes and goals and so on of all the particular parts, right? Not just the universe as a whole, but everything within it as well. So at the top of slide 7, I say, on Aquinas' account, eternal law stems from God and reflects the underlying order and purpose guiding all things in the universe. Okay? Page 158, and I think this was, okay, so this is actually at the very beginning of our excerpt under question 91. Aquinas himself says, oops, this is a quote, again, page 158. The very idea of the government of things and God, the ruler of the universe, has the nature of a law. Thanks to the eternal law, all things, rational or otherwise, instinctively, and I guess that's another point to really make sure we understand, right? That everything has a natural tendency or are naturally inclined toward their good as a result or thanks to eternal law and God's structure and this underlying order or purpose that underlies all that exists. Right, so we are naturally inclined to that, and again, it's thanks to, in large part, thanks to eternal law that is the case. Okay? And one of the things is going to be, right, one of the upshots, what should we do? Well, reflect on what we're naturally inclined to do anyway, and that 99% of the time is going to actually, illuminate what the good is for us. Because again, there's this idea that thanks to God and this eternal law, everything that exists has this natural propulsion or propensity to pursue its own good. Okay? So that's what I was getting at on kind of the third bullet point here on slide 7. Thanks to eternal law, all things, rational or otherwise, instinctively or naturally pursue what is good for them. He says on 160, quote, all things partake somewhat of the eternal law, insofar as, namely, from its being imprinted on them, they derive their respective inclinations to their proper acts and ends. So how is it that we mess it up? That's the question, but more on that later. So that's the idea of the eternal law. Again, it's the overarching game plan, God's overarching game plan, if you will, and it's that thanks to which everything naturally has a propensity to pursue its own good. Okay? Now the natural law, so we want to focus in more on this in a little bit more detail. Again, it's a rational process, and it's that thanks to which we come to be moral creatures, Aquinas would say. And again, because it's rooted in reason, Kant will agree 100% with this sort of idea. Okay? This notion that it's thanks to our rational capacity, right, or this natural law according to Aquinas, right, that we are able to appreciate the ideas of good and evil and become worthy of moral respect and then also moral responsibility, right? We bear moral responsibility then because we have this capacity, this rational capacity to discern the ideas of good and evil and act accordingly. Aquinas and Kant would say. So that's what I'm getting at when I say the second bullet point on slide 8, it is the means, the natural law that is, and it's being rooted in reason, right? It's the means by which we become aware of good and evil. As Aquinas says on 160, quote, this participation of the eternal law in the rational creature is called the natural law. Again, I tried to emphasize that, right? It's the rational sort of illumination of the eternal law, the rational part, whereas the divine law seems to be sort of the non-rational revelation of the eternal law, if you will. Quote, this is from 160 as well. The light of natural reason, whereby we discern what is good and what is evil, which is the function of the natural law, is nothing else than an imprint on us of the divine light, okay, or God's providence, this eternal law. Okay, so we talked about law, where we talked about all the similarities, who Aquinas was, and similarities to, these other important figures, Aristotle, Locke and then Kant. And we talked about this general idea of a law and then the specific versions of law that he talks about. And so, elaborating a bit on this idea of natural law, again, it's rooted in reason. What are some of the things that follow from it? Well, he says, he's famous for this idea of the first precept. What immediately follows from it? First precept of the natural law. So he talks about this, 165 and 166 primarily. So again, I'm saying this on top of slide 9, the first bullet point. So he's suggesting, Aquinas that it is, right, that our reason allows us to see that we are naturally inclined to pursue what is good for us. And I mentioned that a moment ago. Not just us, but everything, thanks to God's eternal law, right, has this natural propensity to choose its own good. Right? It's inclined to pursue that own good. Okay, and then it's thanks to our rational capacity that we realize this. Okay, and this rational capacity also compels us, Aquinas suggests, to facilitate this pursuit of what's good for us from a moral perspective. And so then, as it is for Kant, right, this rational reflective process then illuminates what we ought to do. Okay, so what's the first precept of the natural law? What's the first thing that we sort of realize we ought to do? And it's this 165. Good, this is a quote, good is the first thing that falls under the apprehension of the practical reason. Okay, and this is 166. This is the actual first precept of the natural law. Good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. Okay. So basically, pursue good, avoid evil. Well, that sounds pretty easy, especially if we have a tendency to do it already, as is being suggested. How is it that we mess it all up? Well, that's going to be one of the big criticisms, I guess, if you will, right, that a lot of people have for Aquinas. If this is really as you say, it seems like we wouldn't, as rational creatures. Why, it seems like we wouldn't have the moral dilemmas. What would a moral dilemma even mean, right? If we're all rational and it seems like, we're inclined to pursue the good as it is, and we're all rational, can figure out the best way to do that. Why is it that we have differences in opinion in terms of what the good even is, right? Is one of those sides just not rational and not correct? Why is it that so many of us still seem to not pursue the good and avoid evil, even though we have this natural propensity, says Aquinas, to do so? These are issues that people are going to raise, with respect to this theory. But nevertheless, it's what he suggests, right? That our rational capacity, right, is what lets us realize that, hey, everything has a tendency to pursue its own good, including us. That other humans are like us in this pursuit of the good, and we ought to extend the same sort of concern and respect that we would want ourselves to them as well because of that. Right? And we ought to then, right, because it's doing so is good, pursue the good and avoid the evil. Okay? So what follows from that then, the first precept of the natural law, quote, whatever the practical reason naturally apprehends as man's good or evil, belongs to the precepts of the natural law as something to be done or avoided. Okay, so if upon reflection something seems like it's man's good, right, or human beings, it's good for human beings, then we ought to do it, right? If it's not deemed good for human beings, then we ought to avoid it. Of course, aren't we going to have debates over that, right? Isn't that exactly what we're having debate about, right? Is it good for us to have abortions, to allow the death penalty, right? I don't know. It seems like, again, the issue for a lot of the critics would be the upshot for Aquinas would seem to suggest, right, this reason illuminates the right answer, but yet, all right, it doesn't seem like that's the case for all rational creatures, unless we're going to say that in all these moral debates or dilemmas, one side is just not rational and not correct. It seems like, just pointing to reason is not going to illuminate what we ought to do, right? Because we still have, or at least most people would think that these people having these debates, right, that they're both being rational or they're both reasonable, right? They just disagree on what's ultimately correct. Right? That seems to be a problem for Aquinas because the way he talks, it seems to suggest, so long as we just act rationally enough or reflect enough, right, we'll realize what the good is, and we'll just pursue it as we would naturally do anyway. Again, well, then why is it that that doesn't seem to happen for so many people, and that so many people are conflicting at times? Anyway, okay, so hopefully that concern or criticism is starting to make sense. So turning to slide 10, in view of this, we start to see then, remember that Greek term eudaimonia, or soliciting the good life or a flourishing lifestyle, just like Aristotle would prescribe, right? That's what the morally praiseworthy person ought to do, is Aristotle would say, shape their character in a manner, right? Facilitate, mold their character in a way that where they have habits that are conducive to a flourishing lifestyle, and get rid of the bad habits. So too then, upon reflection, right, Aquinas is going to suggest, be able to figure out what's going to enable us to best pursue good and avoid evil, right? We can kind of get, hence the title of slide 10, a recipe for the good life. In general, or ultimately, on page 166, he says, quote, all those things to which man has a natural inclination are naturally apprehended by reasons being good, and consequently as objects of pursuit, and their contraries as evil and objects of avoidance, end quote. So the idea there is, again, reflect, and if human beings, and be honest in this process, of course, right? If it seems like human beings, right, naturally are inclined to do X, Y, or Z, then he wants to say that is a good thing then, right? If we are naturally inclined to do it, if it's not an artificial sort of process born out of, say, advertising or something like that, right? If we actually have a legit natural inclination towards X or towards Y or towards Z, okay, then those ought to be construed as good things, okay? And they ought to be pursued, he would say. And he offers a kind of a whole catalog of, supposed good things, right? Things that we ought to pursue, including, I give a list of 4, big ones, you might say, that he alludes to on 166: preserving life, right? Maintaining life, respecting life, okay? Procreation, producing life, maintaining life, knowledge, wisdom. I guess he thinks, deep down we all have a kind of philosophical drive within us, if you will. Sociability. So again, that's Aristotle. He and Aristotle on board there. Aristotle argued famously that we're social creatures by nature, and Aquinas would not disagree. He would say, again, that we're all naturally inclined to be social, right? To be together, and we won't be completely happy unless we are. Interesting subject for debate in itself. Okay, so I already alluded to some issues with natural law theory. Again, just natural law theory, right? Sans any of the religious baggage, if you will, right? So, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, right? I mean, even if we set aside all the religious, wrinkles, for those that are atheists, for example, right? Again, you can be an atheist and buy into natural law theory, right? But there's still issues I mentioned, right? So my whole point was, setting aside any religious connotations Aquinas might have and so on, right? There are still criticisms of this version of morality born out of reason, right? Or this focus on our rational capacity. What I just mentioned, right? I kind of feel like I went on about it quite a bit. How is it the case then that we have so many seemingly rational disagreements, right? And again, unless you're going to say that one side is just always not rational, it doesn't seem like reason is as illuminating as Aquinas makes it out to be, because it's not necessarily providing solutions when we have two rational sides that are at odds, right? About abortion, about the death penalty, about how to proceed about any number of things. We have rational disagreements all the time, don't we? So that would be a criticism that revolves around the natural law theory, sans any religious extras, right? So even setting aside any religious components to the theory, if there be any, right? There's still this issue that critics have with, again, just suggesting that reason can just spell out what we ought to do, like Aquinas and then also Kant after him will do. Again, the critics want to suggest it doesn't seem that straightforward. Okay. Then there's also the issue, and this is what I'm getting at on 11, if it really is the case that we have this natural inclination or tendency to pursue what's good for us, what's desirable for us, and not only that, but we have a rational capacity to help sort of shine the light on what that looks like, how is it or why is it that so many of us are off the right path and screw up and are miserable and don't pursue what's actually good? And he really sort of suggests it's for two main reasons. So let's talk about, we're talking about criticisms here. We already talked about one, right? Rooting it in reason seems problematic. Morality and reason, we talked about that ad nauseum at this point. But then also this idea of how do you explain, Aquinas, the fact that very few people actually seem to successfully, continuously, consistently pursue this good, which supposedly they're naturally inclined to do, and they have this rational capacity to help sort of shine the light on and help us figure out what it is. So again, why is it that so many of us are screwing up? So how do you explain so many screw-ups? Or an evil, right? Why is it that so many people aren't pursuing good per se, but things that are detrimental to themselves and others? He attributes to two key factors, for what it's worth, right? A lack of intelligence or reflection. They're not exercising their reason enough, so they're ignorant. Okay. And or he's going to say they're emotional. So he, like Aristotle, emphasizes that not only do we have a rational capacity, but you might say, unfortunately, at least for a lot of its philosophers, a lot of times, we have an emotional component. And this can, as so many of us can probably identify with, can oftentimes override, right, the rational component of our nature. Even when we know, right, I shouldn't be doing this, sometimes our feelings are so overwhelming, right, that they just steer us and dictate what we do anyway. And that kind of makes sense. So Aquinas says a lot of times that's the case. So even though we have a natural tendency and we have this rational tendency to pursue the good or what's good for us, and we have a rational capacity that like shines the light on what that good for us is, we're emotional, we get mad at people, right? We screw up, we're jealous, so on and so forth. So that gets in the way, and sometimes we just don't turn on that light enough, right? We don't turn on the light of the rational capacity enough in order to figure out, what is our proper, in fact, path to pursue eudaimonia or the good life. Okay, so he's going to suggest, again, those screw-ups can be explained, okay, chiefly in these two ways. Okay, so when somebody isn't happy, seems to be doing evil, not pursuing the good, these are the reasons why, typically. Now, if you do throw on, right, your religious sort of connotations and issues, then we have, a whole slew of other criticisms. And, it is tricky with Aquinas because, as the editors of the textbook point out, he does have an appreciation that not everybody, has been graced by God, or however you want to put it, right? That, for whatever reason, they're not familiar with God or God's teachings or so on. And he didn't want to necessarily, think that they were condemned to hell, right? Wouldn't God allow everyone access to what we ought to do, right? And so, again, that seems to be the impetus for him wanting to root it in reason and explicate his theory in a way that suggests, hey, everyone, religious or not, can discern, right, these moral standards and moral truths that apply and so on, and what we ought to pursue and what we ought not to. But nevertheless, right, you read the excerpt. I mean, there's still appeals to eternal law, right? You can't, why is it that we have this capacity for the natural law or this ability to, reflect and so on? He says that's all rooted in eternal law, right? It's thanks to God, okay, that we even have that. So while there is this explicit sort of emphasis on this is a rational process and this can be done entirely rationally, you can't deny that for Aquinas, right, that's still thanks to God. And I just want to point out that, so we alluded to criticisms sans religion or without the religious connotation, right? But then if you throw religion in the mix or considerations of God in the mix, then that complicates things quite a bit too. So, there's been all kinds of discussions regarding the relationship of God and morality and reason. right? How are all of these things intertwined, if at all, right? Some people argue that God is necessary for morality. That's not an argument that's made quite as much. I actually remember my own dad making that argument on a long drive once, and what was really dumbfounding to me is that he's actually agnostic, so he's not even religious, but he was making the argument that religion seems necessary for morality, at least for the bulk of humanity. So this has been something that's been debated throughout, the centuries. To what extent is God necessary, right, or reason, right? Are they both, or is one necessary or not for morality? And I mentioned divine command theory, right? The idea there is, well, God is essential, obviously, for the divine command theorists for considerations of morality. And once you start throwing in, right, any appeal to God, well, then things get, obviously much more complicated. And then there are other than criticisms, right, that enter the equation or enter the discussion. Right? So I wanted to mention one big criticism that's offered, right, in terms of philosophy of religion. Oftentimes when you get moral discussions involved, right, one big criticism that's oftentimes discussed, and that's this idea of the problem of evil. Actually, let me give us some space here. Okay, so this is a notorious problem in the philosophy of religion, and in moral philosophy for the divine command theorists, for example. And so, what is this notorious problem of evil? Okay, well, and this is how the skeptic would introduce this problem. So this I go over on slide 13. Okay, so the problem of evil, it goes like this. If we imagine someone like Aquinas, okay, who is very religious and endorses this idea of God. Okay, take the traditional conception of God, and what I mean by that is, if you were to ask probably 90% of people that believe in God what they mean by God, it would align with this. Okay, God is omniscient, omnipotent, and all good. So what do these mean? So what we mean here is God's all-knowing. He knows everything. He sure knows everything that's going to happen. All-powerful, omnipotent, meaning can do whatever God wants, right? Can stop whatever God wants from happening. God can stop it. Okay? And is all good. Wants good stuff to happen. Doesn't want evil. Okay. So the skeptic says, take this, and then, right, you Aquinas or someone similar who endorses, right, the belief in this traditional conception of God, take that, couple that with the existence of evil, okay, as long as I can get you to say, yes, there is evil, right, and we acknowledge what that evil is, right, then the skeptic wants to say that yields a paradox or problem. And basically the problem or paradox is these two can't possibly coexist. How could it be the case? So, and to appreciate the criticism, right? When you're trying to answer or solve the problem, so to speak. So this is the notorious problem of evil, and then you will get apologists or people that then will try to solve the problem or suggest why it's the case that you can have and believe and endorse in the traditional conception of God and acknowledge that evil exists. So you're not denying this, right? So you're embracing both of these and yet not have a problem, right? So there are going to be people who try to answer, right, or provide a solution to the problem. But the skeptics are going to say, right, that's a problem. You can't solve this, right? How do you explain the existence of evil, presumably many, many, many evils, right? Let's see. So let's turn to slide 14. How do you explain the existence of any evil, let alone the evil that seems to pervade our everyday existence? How do you explain that exists, and yet at the same time there exists a God who knew that evil would exist, could do something about it because it's powerful enough, and doesn't want evil because they're good. Right? That doesn't, for the skeptic, they want to say that doesn't seem to make sense, Aquinas. How do you explain this? And so that then is the notorious problem of evil. Right? Evil seems to be a problem for the religious individual that endorses or believes in this traditional conception of God. Okay, so the skeptic then, at the bottom of slide 14, I point this out. They want to seem to suggest, right, that okay, look, then either there is no God, or God can't be this, right? If we're gonna acknowledge evil exists, okay, then either God doesn't exist or God can't be it. God's essence can't look like this, right? God doesn't amount to this. Okay? God's nature must be different. But as I mentioned, right, there are going to be solutions that are offered historically to this problem. Okay, one, so this is turning to slide 15. We need a contrast. The idea here is a contrast is needed. Let's just put it that way. Contrast is needed. In other words, here the person offering the solution wants to say, look, if everything in the world was good, right, if evil didn't exist, then in some sense good wouldn't exist. Because how would we even have any conception of it? The best way I can think to explain sort of the idea here is to imagine that everything in the world was black. Just imagine for a second that everything in the world is black. And then I asked you to hand me my black comb. Would that be meaningful at all anymore? Would denoting it as a black comb mean anything anymore? No, it wouldn't, right? It wouldn't pick anything out. And so similarly, the person offering this wants to suggest remove the evil from the world and we lose all appreciation or even conception of good, right? You need the evil to kind of contrast with the good to then have some sense in the first place of there being a good, right? It's not the evil, it's not the crappy, right, thing we don't want, it's the opposite, right? To have that appreciation and that very idea of a good, we need the evil. Then. So that's how some say that, hey, God can exist, right? And still allow, if you will, evil to exist because it's needed, if you will, for our appreciation and respect of the good that we have. Okay. Then we have, and you're probably familiar with this one, free will. Hey, what's the alternative? Would you rather that God just created all of us to naturally pursue the good all the time, automatically? Or would you rather that we were just all automatons with no free will? And so this, person offering this solution will say, it's the unfortunate byproduct of, ensuring that we have free will. The unfortunate byproduct is that some people are going to screw up. Okay, and unless you want God to create a bunch of, again, automatons that do not exercise free will, you got to accept that with the creation of entities with free will, he's going to have to allow them to screw up in exercising that free will. Okay? Now, of course, for the skeptic, a lot of these solutions aren't going to be convincing, hence they're not really solutions. But I just thought of, in fairness, having offered the skeptic's position, this would be some of the more common, at least that I'm familiar with, common responses. And then we have, I don't know how convincing this one is, an appeal to, our limited intelligence. So the idea is, hey, we just can't figure it out. It seems these evils seem unbelievable. They seem unexplainable. How could this make sense? But maybe it's, we don't have the divine intelligence of God. So who are we to think that we could ever figure that sort of thing out? Maybe it's the case, and this is why I'm not as convinced by this, because to me it seems to be denying this, right? Because the implication seems to be, hey, whatever this bunch of evils, or what seems like a big evil to us, maybe we're just not smart enough to understand why that's actually ultimately necessary, and hence, I guess, a good thing in God's greater plan, right? So the idea, I guess, in appealing to that is that we just don't appreciate how, in fact, it's necessary or in some sense good. But that seems to be then denying that it was ever evil in the first place, which to me then isn't really a solution to the problem as presented, right? Because it's denying one of the variables. As I mentioned to begin with, if you want to offer a solution to the problem as presented by the skeptics, how can you retain this and retain this? Is it possible? And I would argue that this third one isn't actually retaining both, right? It's just saying, well, what we construe as evil isn't actually evil. Okay? At any rate, those are the three of the most common or popular responses to the very famous problem of evil That's even more common in the philosophy of religion, but it does come up obviously often, in discussions of Aquinas' moral theory. So that's why we spent a little bit of time there talking about it. So we'll turn our attention to a quick summary here, turn into slide 16. So for the natural law theorist, doing what's right basically entails doing what's good for us. And again, this is something that we are automatically inclined to do from the get-go, thanks to God's providence and God's the eternal law and the underlying structure, right, and telos behind everything that happens. Okay. Blah blah blah. Our rational capacity illuminates this, right? I've been comparing it to kind of a light, right? When we reflect, right, we turn on that light and it illuminates what's morally appropriate, among other things. Okay. So our rational capacity illuminates the order and purpose underlying our nature for us, and it dictates what's morally appropriate accordingly. And again, that whole idea, that turning on the light, reflecting rationally, that's what he's getting at with respect to the natural law. That is us accessing the eternal law, right? This underlying structure of everything, right? That's us accessing that when we turn on our rational capacity and turn on that light, so to speak. Okay, I think that's it. We will see as we move on then to lecture 11 and we dive into deontology. We will see how a lot of what we discussed in this lecture then is reminiscent and kind of shines through in what Kant says. So reflection time for you guys. I really did like this video. I think it's helpful. He does a good job. He's kind of funny. Does a good job of describing the gist of Aquinas and what he's getting at in natural law theory. What are your opinions of natural law theory? Do you share some of the concerns we've talked about? That's just the question 1 here. Question 2 gets at that. Gets at the kind of tension I was alluding to earlier, right? If you're going to appeal to reason as a way to just elicit all the answers to all these moral dilemmas, well, why is it the case that we seem to have disagreements, right, amongst rational people regarding what the correct answer is? So that's what I'm getting at here when I say that is, what a way to do when 2 rational agents reach different conclusions about what is truly in our best interest. Okay. And then the third one, if you choose to select or to chime in on that one, what do you think about the problem of evil? Do you think there is a legitimate problem, can't be solved? Or do you think, no, not really a problem? We have evil, but it's not a problem. Right? Do you think it can be solved? What are your thoughts? So that's question 3. Hopefully you enjoyed our discussion of natural law theory, our discussion of Saint Thomas Aquinas, and hopefully you enjoy the Immanuel Kant reading that awaits you, unless you like inflicting pain on yourself and already started reading it.